Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another propaganda review with me, your host, Imperial Dane. Today we are covering Civilization 6, recently released, though forgot a bit about it, which I think should have been an indicator sort of what I'm meaning. I mean, it's not a bad game as such, Civilization 6. I mean, it's got a lot of changes from the previous one. For starters, just one I sort of quickly realized was, or discovered, it's a lot smoother, whereas the previous one took several minutes to get started up. This one's like a minute. You're good to go. That's already just a huge improvement. Graphically, of course, we got a huge start here. It's sort of more of a cartoonish style, which obviously is going to be all to everyone's favorite. Also a bit more cartographic. And sort of look here, it sort of looks a lot more hand drawn, a bit more like an actual map in a sense there. So that's sort of some neat effects there, or details. Also with the units, there's some slight variety here and there with some of them. Others less so. Also, there's some cultural differences here there. For example, units from Asian nations will look a bit more Asian, African nations, a bit more African, for example, though I don't know if that sort of persists long into it, though rather as the game progresses, those things get a lot more similar. For example, once you hit the modern era, it pretty much gets all into American equipment. Machine guns are all American machine guns, and at least for the Europeans, anything there, it's all American uniforms, which, I don't know, gets kind of awkward when it's just, Americans with MG42s, Americans with Panzerschrecks, and so on there. Of course, you also got a load of, different nations, including a lot more sort of attempts at diversifying it with nations like, or civilizations like Norway, Brazil, Congo. Also, huge impacts they've, of course, had on, history. I don't know, don't think so really. So, it also feels like that, but of course, then when it all turns American in terms of equipment by the late game almost, it sort of feels a bit hollow, to be honest, really. Another big hallmark there, of course, is the districts sort of added here, where basically where you just build a lot of buildings. That's it. Now I have to build districts, making your towns, making, a bit more sprawling. They sort of try to make all your decisions a bit more, manageable, having more effect. You've got stuff like encampments, which sort of means, the strategic resources, unless you got two of them, you need an encampment for example to build it. That can give you advantages, also serve as another defensive points. In that sense, they try to create more strategy out of the fields themselves rather than just, being one big hub in a sense. There's sort of more of a sprawling area. Roads sort of happen more naturally as well. So there's a lot there sort of going on. There've been a lot of attempts to make, it more streamlined, smoother, and interesting as well. It also has resulted in a huge emphasis on combat, and in that regard, they've also tried to add in some new things. They've got stuff like, rams, battering rams, and support units like that can then be attached to units. That's all nice and dandy. The problem is it sort of tends to quickly fall short. Really quickly, got military engineers, but there's just no reason to use military engineers, and that role that sort of happens there very quickly can sort of combine into later into core, and then finally armies, which just boost the stats. But there's a sort of fall off then, sort of how much effect you actually get of it. So it also sort of feels a bit like, I mean, when you train them, great, but at some point it sort of just feels a bit weird as well. Diplomatically, it's sort of still not really much there. I mean, you sort of get stuff there indicates what they might. They have agendas. The problem is, I don't know, it just ends up not really being of much use, in part because, in fact, the game is actually surprisingly easily on the lower levels. At one point, I was like, around the birth of Christ, or at least the death of Christ, I could have shot him instead of crucified him as I was playing as the Romans. Plus, I was following Catholicism and spreading out across the world. That felt really weird. I mean, that was just, one of the standard difficulties went up a bit there. The problem is then they decide to balance it by, scripting a lot more. So, for example, all of a sudden, in this game, actually, all of a sudden, Gandhi, the peace guy, just sort of declared formal war on me, which requires them to denounce you, but he didn't. So, in that regard, the problem is there's a lot more sort of puppetry going on, and they're not really good puppeteers. Further on, again, the whole situation there with the denouncement, to try and, make you think harder about declaring war. The problem is they'll denounce you for anything, and they'll think you're a warmonger, even if you try your best, cover it up there by, denouncing them, declaring formal war, all the things you can do there. I mean, you might as well just declare surprise war. At least so it feels to me, which again sort of, I think, highlights some of these again. They really want you to try and make it grander, bigger, but the problem is in many cases the systems feel a bit half-cooked. And overall, it just results in, what works the best here is just beating the ever-living stuffing out of your opponents. And of course, they'll be more than happy, to concede cities and so on there, but the problem is, you've got no reason to it. Most of the time, you can just roll over them and, beat them silly. So that sort of highlights, I think, a bit of the issue here with Civilization 6. It kind of runs into some problems there. In a sense, again, it tries a lot there, but it doesn't quite really take off. And it does tend to, I think, lead to sort of a flat game longer term. I mean, it's fun. It's fun. It's just not a lot of fun. You can sort of keep playing on, hour after hour, day after day. It's in fact the sort of game we can't just go, one more turn. At least I can't, because it becomes extremely monotonous. At some point, you're just swarming your opponents, crashing them, and then that's it for the most part. You also got some social stuff here, which adds a bit more, but ultimately, it's not really much. The Yuki, for example, in a theory, nice just leads to even faster tech progression most of the time, which just again just leads to the whole situation where again by the time of like 1200th century, you're in the industrial area building tanks, for example. So it sort of gets a bit, awkward that way. So I don't know. It kind of feels like, in terms of scaling and balancing, the game needs some more work at the current stage. And it also feels like it needs more work on the combat, because currently it just feels, to an extent, a bit flat as the game progresses. Initially, it's cool. I mean, there's some new interactions going on, but the problem is once you sort of hit the later eras, there's just not a lot there going on. I mean, it just sort of continues with the same progression. I mean, cavalry turn into tanks, and then they're pretty much treated like cavalry to an extent. There's no new unit types, there's no airborne troopers, no marines, nothing like that. So it just sort of kind of hits sort of a flat point. You sort of go, well, all right. I mean, mechanically, warfare doesn't really change from, the first sort of, flinging about with rocks to, nuclear missiles to an extent. So I don't know, it just feels like, it never really sort of progresses much. They sort of a very almost flat curve that sort of goes on with the game. I mean, sure, you get a lot of new stuff, but mechanically, it's not really that different. So, at some point, you're sort of just doing the same. So unless you sort of really get off and just doing it, I mean, it might get too monotonous for some players, because, again, you'll just end up with a case where you just produce units because you can't build more stuff, which is rather what you did in the Civilization. You just built stuff. Here, you built units and then you try to roll over your opponents. So, yeah, I mean, it carries a lot of the sort of same stuff for the city-states as well, but I don't know. I mean, it's not a bad game. It's just one for some reason, I can't quite say I feel is really satisfying. It sort of lacks something. It lacks something in a sort of late game. It gets very, again, monotonous. So while it's a good game, it really, early game, it's really fun there, setting up stuff there. But as the game progresses, it sort of grinds to a halt, and you sort of just find yourself wondering, well, what now besides just crushing everybody? Which is, again, I don't know if that's what they're intending here. So I think that sort of covers here my review of Civilization 6. Again, a good game, but it does feel a bit lacking in some ways. It adds some interesting mechanics, but other mechanics feel very much half-cooked, and there also feels to be very much more puppeteering going on, but also, I mean, obviously there has to be an extent, but the problem is it's very obvious that they're doing it, which rather sort of cuts a bit of the immersion, a bit of the fun, and, further undercuts, faith in the systems. So, yeah, I don't know. It's just, I mean, again, it's fun. I'm certainly enjoyed it. And I'm certainly also having some fun with the series. But again, the problem is, it's more like I can only play it so much, because otherwise, again, the monotony hits. So it's more like, a sort of burst play. So you just sort of do it a bit here, do it a bit there. Again, it's not the sort of, one more turn extra, at least for me. In fact, it's quite the opposite. All right, I'll do one more turn, then I really got to do something else, because otherwise, I don't know, I'm just going to forget about the game again, because it's just so, in some ways, again, monotonous. So again, while it can be fun, at the same time, it sort of feels like oddly balanced fun, which again means you can only do it in small bursts. It's a bit like eating candy. You can do a bit there, but too much and you quickly get sick of it. So I think that's sort of, covers here the review. Hopefully there's been enlightening for those curious about the game. If it has, feel free to, well, get it, I suppose, or just comment on it. Again, might not be the most satisfactory review, but again, I'm sort of feeling a bit, ambivalent about it, really. Again, a part of me likes it, another part of me is kind of like, did I really need this game after all? So it's a bit of sort of an awkward thing here. Because again, at some point again, it feels this sort of weird monotony. It's not, bad monotony in a sense, but it's just this weird one where you sort of kind of go, well, isn't there better things I can do? Because again, it just very much becomes more of just the same even as you progress. It doesn't quite feel, as impressive anymore. So yeah, again, hope you liked this. Hope this was enjoyable to you and hopefully learned something from it. Just help you make a decision on the game. If you did, subscribe, like, share, and comment on it. This is Imperial signing off. To another time, another review. Cheers.